Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Natalia had never been the kind of woman who could be easily broken. Even after surviving a dark and suffocating marriage to Sidwell, a man whose influence reached far beyond the visible structures of Port Charles, she held on to a flicker of hope, a belief that someday, somehow, she would break free from the invisible web of control he had spun around her life. For years, Sidwell had exerted his power through manipulation, fear, and psychological warfare, ensuring that Natalia felt powerless, cornered, and voiceless. But deep inside, Natalia's spirit had never surrendered. It was merely waiting, watching, planning, gathering the strength she needed for the day she could finally strike back. When Sonny offered her a lifeline, an escape route to Belize with the resources, protection, and anonymity she needed to start over, Natalia hesitated. It wasn't that she didn't trust Sonny, she knew he had no interest in hurting her. She understood that he was trying to keep her safe, especially with Ada Justine relentlessly closing in on both of them. Sonny believed that by removing Natalia from the chessboard, he could prevent her from becoming a pawn in a much larger legal battle. He assumed that sending her to Belize, where he held assets and political leverage, would buy her a clean slate and buy him time to restructure his defenses. It was a strategic retreat meant to preserve what little order was left. But for Natalia, escape meant silence. Escape meant forfeiting her final chance to expose the man who had ruined so many lives, including her own. She knew that once she disappeared, the truth would go with her. So even as Sonny urged her to go, perhaps even with genuine compassion in his voice, she found herself unable to comply. Her instincts screamed that the time had come to stop running. She had seen too much, endured too much, and now, finally, she had the evidence. Over the past several weeks, Natalia had quietly collected damning proof of Sidwell's criminal empire. Bank transfers routed through shell corporations in the Caribbean. Anonymous contracts with known assassins. Surveillance footage capturing clandestine meetings with figures on Port Charles's most wanted lists. And even recordings of Sidwell himself, issuing veiled threats with the kind of cold efficiency that made the blood freeze. She had compiled it all, hundreds of documents, encrypted files, secure cloud backups, and intended to turn everything over to Justine. Not to earn clemency or negotiate a deal, but to see justice done. Sidwell was no mere corrupt businessman. He was a puppeteer, a shadow kingpin responsible for a trail of bodies stretching across continents. If these files reached the right hands, Sidwell's empire would crumble. But Natalia had underestimated her enemy. What she didn't know was that Sidwell had already sensed her defection. He had monitored her communications, intercepted encrypted messages, and traced her activity in the shadows. He was always watching. And he had no intention of letting her win. On a storm-swept night, as thunder rolled over the rooftops of Port Charles, Natalia stood alone in her temporary hideout, unaware that she had already been marked. Her suitcase was half-packed. The USB drives were hidden in a stitched compartment of her jacket. She had just written a final message, part confession, part farewell, that she planned to send to Marco. But before she could act, the door creaked open. Sidwell entered, calm and collected, as if he owned the world and this moment was merely another item on his agenda. There was no rage in his expression, only that familiar smirk that had haunted her memories for years. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She knew exactly why he was there. He didn't say much. He never had to. But before he left, he scrawled a single sentence on the mirror with her lipstick, a final insult that would taint the crime scene like a signature soaked in venom. Women who talk too much rarely live long. He left her there, lifeless, elegant, tragic, like a ghost trapped in the last chapter of a story no one had dared to read aloud. And when the authorities found her, the evidence had already been doctored. Security footage showed a shadowy figure resembling Sonny entering the building. A planted burner phone contained threatening messages apparently from Sonny, painting him as a spurned associate desperate to silence Natalia. It was clean, calculated, and merciless. Sidwell had orchestrated every detail to make it look like Sonny had finally crossed a line that even he couldn't return from. With Natalia gone, the only person who knew the full truth about Sidwell's criminal activities was gone too, at least, that's what Sidwell believed. What he hadn't accounted for was the ripple effect of Natalia's final days. She had left behind a trail, fragments of her work, hints and encrypted clues that someone might one day follow. And that someone was Marco. Despite their strained relationship, Natalia had never stopped watching over her son from afar. She had struggled with guilt for pushing him away, especially after he came out as gay, a moment that fractured their bond, not out of hate, but out of fear and misunderstanding. Sidwell had seized on that vulnerability, embracing Marco as the surrogate child he could mold and manipulate. But even Marco, as conflicted as he was, felt the tremor of loss when he learned of Natalia's death. And when the official story pinned the murder on Sonny, something inside him rebelled. Marco was no stranger to secrets. He had grown up in the gray zones of morality and power. But the news of his mother's murder, and the hollow explanations surrounding it, ignited a need for truth. In his grief, he found Natalia's last message, a hidden file embedded in the metadata of a shared photo, encrypted with a phrase only he would understand. In it was a video, Natalia, weary but defiant, detailing everything. The names. The accounts. The crimes. The danger. And most painfully, a direct plea to Marco, not for forgiveness, but for justice. That was the moment something shifted. Marco, once the favored son of Sidwell's carefully curated image, turned. He didn't go to the police. He didn't go to Sonny. Instead, he went underground, using every contact, every tool, and every skill he had absorbed while walking the line between legality and corruption. He began reconstructing his mother's investigation, chasing her trail backward through lies, shell companies, and silent witnesses too terrified to speak. And with every new piece of information, his resolve hardened. Natalia's death had not been in vain. It had awakened something fierce. Sidwell had killed a woman. But in doing so, he had unleashed a force that would not be silenced. Marco was no longer the passive bystander. He was now the weapon of truth, sharp, quiet, and inevitable. And as the streets of Port Charles whispered with tension, as Sonny prepared for the legal war Sidwell had engineered, there was another war coming. One that Sidwell could not predict. One born not of vengeance alone, but of clarity, purpose, and a son's promise to finish what his mother had started. Because Natalia had never been weak. She had never been silent. And even in death, her voice would echo, through Marco, through justice, and through the fall of the empire Sidwell had built atop the graves of those who dared defy him. The marriage between Natalia and Sidwell had long since withered into a hollow shell of bitterness and regret. Whatever remnants of affection or loyalty may have once existed between them had been eroded by years of manipulation, betrayal, and a toxic power dynamic that left Natalia emotionally depleted. The final wedge between them came in the form of Marco, the son Natalia had with a previous husband. When Marco came out as gay, Natalia, grappling with her own upbringing and cultural limitations, failed him in the most profound way. Instead of offering acceptance, she recoiled. Whether it was fear of judgment, guilt, or the inability to process her own internalized beliefs, Natalia's rejection carved a deep wound into their relationship, one that, for a time, seemed irreparable. Into that void stepped Sidwell. With the cold precision of a master manipulator, he extended a hand to Marco, cloaking his true intentions beneath the guise of unconditional support. He became the father figure Marco never had, offering the warmth and validation the young man had long craved. But Sidwell's embrace was not born from genuine affection, it was calculated. He saw in Marco not only a vulnerable heart but an exploitable resource. By nurturing Marco's loyalty and binding him through carefully orchestrated emotional dependency, Sidwell molded him into a potential instrument for furthering his own political and criminal ambitions. The more isolated Marco became from Natalia, the more deeply Sidwell's influence took root. But there was one thing Sidwell miscalculated. One deeply human element that all his strategies failed to account for. Despite everything, the bond between mother and child, though frayed, though scarred, was not severed. Marco may have grown distant, even resentful, but he never stopped caring about Natalia. She remained a painful part of his story, one he had buried beneath anger and silence, but not forgotten. And when news reached him that Natalia had been found dead under suspicious circumstances, with Sonny quickly painted as the perpetrator, something inside him snapped. Marco knew better than most how the justice system could be bent, how truths could be rewritten by those with the right leverage and the coldest intent. He refused to accept the story the authorities offered, and with instincts honed by a lifetime around predators cloaked in civility, he began digging. In the digital detritus Natalia left behind, Marco found the breadcrumbs she had scattered, documents tucked away in hidden cloud folders, encrypted voice memos, and most haunting of all, a video message recorded days before her death. In the flickering light of her final hours, Natalia's face appeared on screen, weary yet determined. She confessed everything. The extent of Sidwell's crimes. The corruption, the murders, the trafficking of influence across borders. She had been tracking him for years, and she knew the cost. In halting words, Natalia admitted her failures as a mother, her fear, her silence, the damage her rejection had done. Tears streamed down her face not from fear of death, but from shame that she hadn't been strong enough to protect her son from the man who now wielded power over both of them. Her voice cracked as she begged for forgiveness, and then, more powerfully, pleaded with Marco to carry on what she could no longer finish. Not out of vengeance, she said, but for justice. For truth. Marco, overcome with grief and rage, made a decision. He would not go to the police, not when the system had already been corrupted by Sidwell's reach. Instead, he would wage a war of his own, a quiet, methodical dismantling of the empire Sidwell had built with blood and lies. He began reaching out to the shadows. To former associates Sidwell had betrayed, to disgruntled employees, to terrified witnesses who thought no one would ever come for their stories. Piece by piece, Marco collected their testimonies, their records, their secrets. Every conversation, every deal, every threat Sidwell had made in confidence now became a weapon in Marco's hands. At the same time, Sidwell began to make bold moves in public. He declared Sonny's reign in Port Charles over, issuing subtle threats through press conferences and private meetings, rallying political allies and criminal interests alike to his cause. Rumors swirled that he had backed multiple assassination attempts on Sonny, all of which had mysteriously failed. Frustrated and cornered, Sidwell turned to a different tactic: smear Sonny's name beyond repair. By framing him for Natalia's murder, Sidwell aimed to destroy Sonny's reputation, isolate him from his supporters, and neutralize him as a threat without ever pulling a trigger. It was a brutal stroke of strategy, one Sidwell thought to be genius. But Sonny was no fool. He knew the signs of a setup when he saw them. The timing of Natalia's death, the sloppy evidence, the whispers in legal circles that Justine had been tipped off anonymously, it all reeked of orchestration. His instincts screamed that the noose was tightening, and he began to question everyone around him. The safe haven he had established in Belize, the allies he once trusted, the advisors he confided in, all now seemed suspect. Sonny began preparing for war, not just in court, but in the shadows where real power was won and lost. Then, unexpectedly, Marco came forward, not to expose Sonny, but to align with him. When Marco shared the video of Natalia, and the damning evidence she had compiled, Sonny understood the magnitude of what he was up against. Two men who had once occupied opposite ends of a moral spectrum now found themselves standing side by side against a common enemy. The convergence of their grief, their fury, and their knowledge formed an alliance neither had anticipated, but both knew was necessary. Their partnership was not forged from trust, but from necessity. They understood that they were playing a game of survival, and only by pooling their resources, their insight, and their pain, could they hope to unravel Sidwell's web of deceit. Together, they coordinated a counteroffensive, leaks to journalists, secret subpoenas, and back-channel investigations. They unearthed off-the-book transactions, exposed hidden assets, and forced neutral players to choose sides. Meanwhile, Sidwell sensed the tide shifting. The press grew suspicious. Politicians once eager to be seen at his side began canceling appointments. Anonymous whistleblowers appeared. His operations started suffering quiet delays. And for the first time in years, the man who had orchestrated so many downfalls began to feel the ground shake beneath him. What he didn't realize was that the earthquake had started the moment he underestimated a mother's final words and a son's resolve to see justice through. Because Marco wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting to restore his mother's name, to reclaim a legacy she had nearly lost in her silence, and to expose the man who thought he could rewrite history with blood and influence. And Sonny, seasoned and bruised by war, knew that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption, for both of them. In the distance, Port Charles braced for a reckoning. One that would not be televised or negotiated, but played out in shadows and silence, until the truth finally stood, unshakable, above the ruins of lies. The resistance began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A single leaked financial document tied to an offshore account Sidwell had long since buried under layers of corporate shell games, an anonymous audio recording, delivered to a local journalist, in which Sidwell's voice could be heard issuing a threat masked as business advice. A confidential internal inquiry initiated by a minor official suddenly emboldened by whispers of greater powers moving against Sidwell. Each piece, on its own, seemed small, manageable. But together, they signaled the cracking of a carefully cultivated facade. Sidwell, long confident in the impermeability of his empire, began to sense it slipping from his grasp. He responded with the only tactics he trusted, distraction and deception. He planted scandalous rumors about Marco, insinuating ties to extremist groups, staged incidents to discredit him, and released doctored videos to muddy his credibility. Meanwhile, Sidwell intensified his campaign against Sonny, tightening the noose in legal circles and stirring paranoia through a calculated media narrative. But this time, he was facing something far more dangerous than an adversary seeking power. He was facing someone who had nothing left to lose. Marco had learned from watching Sidwell, the patience required to build a narrative, the ruthlessness necessary to execute a plan, the silence it took to strike at the right moment. But unlike Sidwell, Marco didn't care about wealth, influence, or even personal redemption. He didn't seek sympathy or understanding. He wasn't chasing public approval or courtroom closure. What he sought was something colder and purer, justice. And for Marco, justice did not necessarily mean legal prosecution or prison bars. It meant truth unveiled without filter. It meant exposing the monster not just to a jury, but to the entire world. Every lie Sidwell told, every life he manipulated, every corrupt alliance he forged, Marco intended to drag it all into the light. Slowly but surely, Marco dismantled the machinery of fear that Sidwell had used to keep people silent, one witness at a time, one file at a time, unraveling the legacy Sidwell had spent years manufacturing. The deeper he dug, the more allies Marco gained, not from loyalty, but from shared trauma. Victims, silenced for years, now found their courage reflected in Marco's quiet, relentless fury. Though Natalia was gone, her voice, captured in her final message, immortalized in the files she risked her life to compile, had planted a seed that no amount of spin or suppression could kill. That seed took root in Marco's fractured heart, and from it grew a force that neither grief nor fear could extinguish. His mission was not driven by vengeance, but by a sense of duty to the mother who had failed him, yet died trying to make amends. He carried the weight of both betrayal and love, of loss and unfinished forgiveness. And in that complexity, he became the one thing Sidwell could never predict, a son transformed into a reckoning. Marco no longer trembled in the shadows of powerful men. He became the shadow that haunted them. He didn't need a courtroom to deliver a verdict, because truth, when unearthed with enough clarity, became a weapon more devastating than any prison sentence. Sidwell, once so certain of his invincibility, now found himself walking a path he had paved for others. A path of paranoia, of crumbling alliances, of secrets unraveling faster than he could suppress them. His control was slipping, not with a bang but with a whisper, a quiet shift in public perception, a cold shoulder from a former ally, a donor backing out of a deal with no explanation. These weren't coincidences, they were orchestrated dismantlings. He tried to fight back with the same tools he had always used, but they no longer worked. Fear no longer silenced those who once cowered. Money no longer bought the loyalty he demanded. As the walls closed in, Sidwell, who had laughed at the pain of others, who had profited from silence, now began to taste the dread he had so liberally fed to the world. The game he had controlled for so long was now slipping from his fingers. And in the distance, Marco stood, silent, unyielding, watching the man who had once tried to erase his mother now being erased by the very truth he thought he could bury.